Hey everyone, welcome to All Tech is Human. I'm your host, the founder of All Tech is Human, David Ryan Polgar. Today, really excited to have Yaël Eisenstat and Kate Klonick, two experts on Section 230. Before we get started, I do want to thank everybody for joining us. Also want to mention that if you're interested, get involved with our community at alltechishuman.org. We focus as an accelerator for tech consideration and a hub for responsible tech. I also want to thank our organizational partner, TheBridge. You can check them out at thebridgework.com. So let's do a little introduction, or maybe they don't need any introduction. I'm sure you've seen a lot of them all over the internets. But first, we have Yaël Eisenstat, who is the visiting fellow at Cornell Tech's Digital Life Initiative. She's also a former CIA analyst and a former global head of elections integrity at Facebook. So Yaël, welcome to our discussion. We also have Kate Klonick, who is the associate professor at St. John's University Law School and an affiliate fellow at Yale Law School, and also an expert on Facebook's oversight board. So Kate, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So Section 230, seeing it all over right now, something that not a lot of people talked about a few years ago, even though it derives from a Communications Decency Act of 1996, but it seems to be really hot, even hot politically speaking. Let's get at these 26 words that oftentimes we call the Magna Carta, if you will, of the internet, or the 26 words that created the internet. They are: no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provider by another information content provider. Okay, that can be a little clunky. So Kate, let's kick it off here. Give us a little background and explanation on what Section 230 is.
Yeah, I think for most people, the easiest way to understand Section 230 is to think about kind of the environment that was happening, the background that was happening to when it was created. It was part of a larger bill called the Communications Decency Act, which you mentioned. That whole bill later got struck down in a Supreme Court decision, but Section 230 survived. But that bill was really aimed around a time when the internet was being barraged by all types of kind of, I guess you would call it bad content, or not ideal content, stuff you didn't want to see over your breakfast cereal when you logged in. And that included a lot of pornography, a lot of spam, and legislators could not actively ban those things because of the First Amendment. And so they wanted to empower platforms and companies to be able to take them down and incentivize them to do so. But what was happening in the courts was that there were all of these decisions happening in states and in some federal courts that were basically at odds, which were kind of giving companies mixed messages. Some were kind of saying, okay, you can moderate this content and we're not going to hold you liable for all of the bad content on your platform. We're not going to, just because you took down this one thing doesn't mean you're responsible for this other thing that you missed and didn't take down. Then that was like under a civil liability thing. Like, it would be like holding them like the New York Times or something like that for publishing something on their platform. And then, so they said they weren't going to hold them liable in that way. And then other courts said the opposite, said, listen, you started to take down some things. You dipped your toe in, you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound type of thing. And so we're going to hold you liable for everything posted on your site, whether you have noticed it or not. This creates two different incentives for companies. Keep everything up, right? Because if they do any moderation, it's going to cost them tons and tons of money in litigation, or take everything down and over censor. And so what Section 230 did was basically created those 26 words, created this carve out of kind of a shield of immunity for platforms on the internet from civil liability with causes of action. So that if Yaël defames me online and I tell Facebook, you can't, not that you would ever do that.
She won't. She's a very nice person.
Yes. And so that kind of, in the pre-1996, pre-CDA 230 days, that, Yaël could have also sued Facebook as well as suing me. And she would have wanted to, because Facebook had deeper pockets. Not that Facebook existed in 1996. It was like, I don't know, like Usenet.
This is before Google, right? This is
Google. This is before YouTube. This is before all of that. this is Usenet. This is like all types of messaging boards is a lot of what this was like speaking to. So it was a very different time, which is another thing to kind of keep in mind. But anyways, I've talked too long, but to sum up, basically, with Section 230, Yael can like ask Facebook to take down my post. She can tell them why it's defamatory against her or why she doesn't like it. And Facebook has its own rules that they've developed kind of in the shadow in the space that Section 230 provided that lets them kind of govern what their site looks like and to decide what they're going to do to take down or keep up speech. And so that's really what Section 230 did, how it was interpreted by courts in the years following its release. And that's kind of where we are today.
Okay. And as an interesting factoid, one of those carve-outs, you mentioned there are a few with Section 230, would be for copyright infringement, which was one of the reasons why people who are being cyberbullied would oftentimes trademark their name, because it was easier to take that down than going after the platform. So, yeah, I want to bring you in to the conversation. I saw a piece that you recently wrote that was housed on Cornell Tech. It was a talk that kind of connected with South by Southwest, a talk that you were kind of planning on doing with the panel there. You wrote the notion that a few tech companies who steer over 2 billion, how over 2 billion people communicate, find information, and consume media enjoy the same blanket immunity as a truly neutral internet company that provides a service makes it clear that it is time for an upgrade to the rules. So I'd love for you to unpack that statement and maybe give us a little more context and explanation about how you think we need to upgrade Section 230.
Sure. And that was a perfect start to explaining it, because people are hearing this Section 230 phrase now ever since President Trump wrote his executive order threatening to basically kill it. So I come at it from the perspective of really maybe a little bit of principled notions here of what do we think the responsibility should be for real world consequences? Like, who should bear the responsibility for real world consequences of things that might happen because of something that happened online? And so what's interesting is I understand the principles of Section 230 and fully understand why they were written in 1996. And at its core, I think it made sense. It's what many people credit it with why the internet has flourished. Obviously, if you held, and again, this was before social media even existed or before a company like Facebook existed. So the idea of if I was going to write a blog and I was using the software of a hosting site, and I wrote something terrible about Kate, since she brought up this example, defaming her.
I hope we didn't start a war here. You know, this.
If I wrote something terrible about Kate,
might be a flame war after this. Yes.
In 1998, let's say, and you know, I'm sure she was a terrible person in 1998. Clearly, it makes sense that I should be the one responsible for what I wrote about her, as opposed to the company who created the software in which I am writing this blog. But here's the problem. In 2020, we have a completely different reality of what these companies look like. And while it still makes sense to me that a company like Squarespace, if I build a website and I use Squarespace or any other company, I should be responsible for what I write on that website, not Squarespace. I should be held liable if I do something illegal on that. That I get. But the difference is with a company like Facebook or YouTube or Twitter or others, the idea that they are just these neutral intermediaries that just shouldn't bear any responsibility for what people post on their platforms would imply that they aren't in any way actively participating in how that content is disseminated. So obviously I'll use Facebook as an example because I worked there for a while. Facebook curates content, right? Their algorithms decide what they're going to amplify, what they're going to boost, what you're going to see. Sometimes their algorithms might recommend to you a certain site, a certain group, a certain, and I really want to get into an example from that later. I just don't want to take up all the time right now. So to say that that company is just this intermediary and should bear no responsibility is really surprising to me. Now, does that mean I want to kill Section 230? No, I think any of us who really look at this topic absolutely want to keep elements of Section 230. But there are ways that we could upgrade it to fit the 2020 information ecosystem. And I would be happy to give you my thoughts on what that looks like. But just one example, I mean, let's look at, I focus a lot on elections. I mean, most of my life in government, it was really about protecting democracy. So that's the lens I look at a lot of this through. You know, there has still been zero accountability for 2016. It was a lot of, we're sorry, we know we have to do better. Nobody could have known this was going to happen. I'm sorry, but you actually let Russians purchase political ads using rubles on your platform, and nobody's responsible for any of this. So I look at, let's move forward with how can we define certain companies and how can we upgrade these rules to fit the reality of what some of these companies have become today.
So if you mention that, you're talking about defining the company. We call them social media companies, but social media companies do not fall under a traditional media company. If you think about a media company, though, which would fall under the FCC, you have the idea of filtering and then publishing, whereas a social media company does usually the opposite, where something is published and then it's filtered. Right. And that's usually because of scalability, because of this idea of having an immense amount of user generated content. Yaël, you mentioned the problems surrounding 2016 and really the larger conversation right now that social media is tied in with the health or the health, I guess, of our democracy at large. And that's a big deal. So, Kate, where do you think we stand on this with defining what social media companies are? Because if now, to Yael's point, if we're viewing it instead of hosting content and relaying a form of communication, we're seeing this as something different, like it's amplifying. And we oftentimes talk about this as kind of spidering. The way I like to think about it is we don't have a megaphone online. It's more like a symphony where you have a conductor and that's connected with a lot of different band players, which can virally spread a message. So, Kate, what do you think with how this changes our definition?
Yeah, I actually, and this is a rare thing for kind of a lawyer to say, is I think that kind of the publisher platform distinction that is laid out in Section 230 is kind of logy and imperfect. I think the term media company doesn't quite work. There is actually maybe, it's very hard, right? Because humans reason through analogy. We understand things by comparing it to things that we already know. But there isn't a perfect analogy here. It is, I've never heard the symphony metaphor, but I've heard like everything else under the sun, from pipe to a stack to a publisher to a bookstore to a shopping mall. And so like there's a million different ways. And my own is, which is like tends to be like I think of them as little like private governance structures. But all of those are completely imperfect and they mean different things to different people. I think that we were talking before the show and we were kind of like, backstage, and Yael was saying, and I was agreeing with her, that the way that this has moved and the way the technology has changed has made it so there is really not any one way that you can fix everything. All of the products are completely different. They're used differently. Their meaning changes rapidly over time. Like how people, TikTok was just a couple of months ago, TikTok was just like, really goofy videos. And now it's increasingly used for political messaging and subversive messaging from like different types coming out of different types of authoritarian regimes. Kind of there's just like all of these things, the meaning of these products changes all the time. So I don't know how you're going to ever get a one size fits all solution to this. And I think that you're going, like, not only will you undo a lot of good work that has been done to get us where we are today, even though people think that's a pretty bad place, but I think it could have been, I could think it could be a lot worse. I think that like a reform to Section 230 that doesn't take that into account, just the undefinable nature of this is never going to be any good.
And Kate, you mentioned TikTok, and as disclosure, I do serve on TikTok's Content Advisory Council, but I am not a K-pop stan. I do need to brush up on my K-pop. But Kate, you also mentioned shopping malls, so let's go there. One thing I found really interesting was that famous kind of story back in 2003 during the Iraq War. Crossgates Mall, a mall in upstate New York, in Albany, New York, had an incident where a father was wearing a Peace on Earth t-shirt. He was kicked out of the mall. They claimed it might have been for other things, but it got into what is a mall. It's a public gathering space inside of a inside of a private company. Therefore, it'd be defined not as a public square, but as a kind of quasi public square. So I'd be curious to hear from both of you about where Facebook and other forms of social media, where does that fall? Because we oftentimes like to say, especially Twitter, we like to say it's a public square, but is it really a public square? Yael, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do.
Okay.
Well, it is a public square, but it's a highly curated public square. And the idea that Facebook doesn't censor is actually silly, because they actually do decide what you will and won't see. But they have taken over so much of our public discourse. So I do think they're a public square, but that's not how I would define them in terms of Section 230. Can I go back to like how I would actually define them for Section 230? Agree with Kate. Listen, technology changes. It's going to continue to change. There's no one way you could define anything now that's going to like hold for the next 20 years. That said, and this is where I know I'm not a lawyer, but I think it's important whenever we think about things that have profound impacts on society. And I don't mean to imply that Kate meant only lawyers should talk about this. I'm just saying for my own sake, I don't want to see a lot of these conversations end up getting ceded to lawyers. And I would like to back up and say, what do we want as a society? Do we want a platform and a company like Facebook to have this much power? We've ceded all decision-making to Facebook in terms of how to write the rules of the road for any, like whether it's content moderation, whether it's, I don't want to just focus on content moderation, but whether it's anything that happens on their platform. And there are some basic fundamental things that should not be ceded to the CEO of a for-profit internet company. And some of those things do involve the things that government are supposed to protect: harms against children, harms against our democracy and elections, harms against, like, these are the things that society, through our governments, are supposed to actually define and protect against. So what does that mean? Because right now, the problem with Section 230, there's several problems. So one of the problems is that victims have no recourse, right? And when Kate and I were at this one workshop together in DC, this became a big topic of the afternoon session, is that if I am a true victim of something that happened because of something that occurred online, I have no recourse, because immediately that company can claim Section 230. I might have recourse against the person who the actual individual created harm, but what if that company actually bear responsibility for some of it? And I can't even take them to court because they will claim this Section 230 immunity. And I'm going to give you one example, and I would love to hear either of your thoughts to this set of questions. Okay. Let's look at a really recent example. We have this situation where there's a group called the Boogaloo Boys, right? And the Boogaloo Boys, as short as I can possibly say it, they're basically a group who believe that we should, in civil war, and they want to see civil war come back to America. And so they've been very active on Facebook. And recently we saw that in Oakland, some of the Boogaloo Boys exploited the protests going on in Oakland, and they ended up actually infiltrating the protests, and then they ended up killing not a police officer, but a security officer. And here are the three questions I want to ask about this, and it does apply to sort of this immunity and who bears responsibility. The first question is, should Facebook bear responsibility for the fact that the Boogaloo Boys have these groups and these pages and whatnot on Facebook? Now, that one will be debated, and there will be people on both sides of that debate. And I see both sides of that debate. It's free speech. They have the right to express their opinions. That's a really big debate. Okay, let's go to the next step. It turns out that the two men who met in real life and killed that officer actually met in a Facebook group for the Boogaloo Boys. So the second question is, should Facebook bear responsibility for the fact that those two men actually met in a Facebook group, and one of them apparently allegedly hatched out the plan in that Facebook group? Again, that's a difficult question and can be debated. The third question is the heart of it. This is what I care about. What if you found out that those two men weren't even looking for that Boogaloo group, but Facebook's recommendation engine recommended that group to them? And that's the core that bothers me. Okay. Because when I look at reforming Section 230, I look not at whether they're a publisher or a platform. I look at these guys, these companies' recommendation engines. I don't want them responsible for if someone posts disinformation. I want them responsible for if their recommendation engines and their amplification, their algorithms amplify the disinformation. I want them responsible if their recommendation engine actually introduced those two people or introduced them to the group, and then they went out and killed a human being. These are the things that I would love to hear your thoughts on, like, where does the responsibility lie in those several steps? And that's what I look at.
Well, Kate, do you have any thoughts on that? And we also had a question from Gina talking about the feed algorithms. Are they really at the heart of the issue? And it's a big thing we've been talking about. YouTube. There was a big media storm recently talking about how their algorithm, since it was maybe so highly tuned in with engagement, which is tied in with advertising, since they are kind of advertising-based models, how it potentially led people down, quote unquote, rabbit holes, which would go from Donald Trump to Alex Jones, which would go into more kind of conspiratorial types of theories. So what are your thoughts on that with, on algorithmic kind of transparency and where we might be going with this? Because that seems to be a big push right now, especially in the media.
Yeah, I think we're getting a little far afield to a certain extent from what Section 230 was designed to do when we're starting to talk about kind of some of those things. And I think that's a conversation to have. Like if it is one thing to not hold, to hold Facebook liable for keeping up defamation about me and like let them escape liability, right? And it's another thing to actually have a more causative role in perpetuating harm, or even creating like the genesis of a harm, as they kind of Yaël just described. And so I see that. I certainly see that is like where people's minds are, but I don't know that like class action lawsuits would be the thing to solve like kind of some of these things, or that algorithmic transparency is necessarily an actual phrase that has much meaning. I don't think that even Facebook knows completely how all of their algorithms work, or at least I don't know like that they could have predicted all of the outcomes. And Yaël I think that she probably disagrees with me, but go ahead, Yaël.
Oh, no, finish your thought. I was just smiling.
No. It was just, just a really kind of quickly one. I love the Crossgate Mall example, mostly because my grandparents grew up, I had a house in Albany, and that's where I'd go as a kid, and I went to Crossgate Mall all the time. So I actually know exactly where that is. There's a long tradition, a number of cases in First Amendment law, Prunier Shopping Mall, and a few others, let's specifically talk about the role that the space that a mall is. And it's not something that the court comes to a full resolution on. It's still kind of like in many ways a very interesting question, because it is a public-private space. And I think that that's what's so interesting about this space right now. So like to Yael's point, that if you're making the newsfeed part of your product that you're selling, right? If you're making that like the hot dog you're selling in the mall, then there's one level of liability. If you are holding people liable for speech that's on their shirts as they're walking through the mall, that's a different kind of liability to split up kind of where I think we're talking about things, right? And so is selling a hot dog in a mall speech? I would say no, it's conduct. And so like that's kind of where I would say it doesn't even have Section 230 immunity at all. Okay. So that's just to kind of like draw that distinction.
I want to go back to the example that Yaël mentioned about people potentially meeting on Facebook and how they would create kind of a causal connection to actual harm. Reminds me of one of the carve-outs around sex trafficking. A lot of people a few years ago were talking about Backpage. You also had casual encounters from Craigslist. The idea that people were, creating some type of prostitution engagement through this platform, and that seemed like something they weren't able to have that Section 230 immunity. So Kate, could you maybe explain that a little more, or where the thinking is on that?
The thinking is on what having Section 230 immunity?
Well, with sex trafficking.
Sedefasta stuff. Yeah. Yeah, so that was coming out of a Ninth Circuit opinion. The impetus for Sesta was that there was a case called Doe v. Backpage, and Backpage was was being notified that people were doing sex trafficking online using their site. I guess you would call it like an evil Craigslist is usually how I describe Backpage. And they were being notified, and they were continuing to allow ads to be on their site for that knowingly contributed to sex trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
And the Ninth Circuit held that because the ads were actually protected from under Section 230 because they were speech. No one liked that outcome. It was consistent with kind of the Section 230 doctrine. It's one of those things where it's like you stick to the principles. Sometimes you're going to get outcomes you don't like. And so they went to a number of people, a number of advocates, drafted some legislation known as the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act and Fighting Online Sex Trafficking Act, I think, in the House and Senate respectively. And then they sent those and they passed those, and they were riders to Section 230 that basically took this type of activity out of Section 230 immunity. So and so that's kind of, now we have a number of things. And I think we mentioned this earlier, but we should kind of just make sure everyone knows Section 230 does not apply to copyright, for example. Mm-hmm. It does not apply to things that are federally, like criminally, federal crimes, right? So if like Facebook is notified that a federal crime is happening on its website or something else, they are obligated to take it down, or they're going to be prosecuted federally, right? So there are mechanisms for them doing that, but everything else is a gray area. Sesta moved it into one of those verboten things that made them that they had to remove that type of behavior.
Where this is getting
back to points that I actually disagreed with a little bit.
Sure, please.
On algorithmic transparency and whatever catchphrase we want to use. I totally agree with Kate that the conversation that I brought up starts to go afield from the original intent of Section 230. But unfortunately, companies like Facebook use Section 230 in a much more broad way than what it was intended to begin with. And they will, if somebody tries to say, let's say, I'm just completely projecting here, this is just a notional idea, but let's say the family of that officer who was killed in Oakland wants to sue Facebook for connecting those. Again, I don't know if the recommendation engine connected them, but they did meet in a Facebook group. Immediately, Facebook will claim Section 230 to have it thrown out, and chances are they won't even get to have their day in court. So yes, I understand that it's outside the original scope, but unfortunately, Section 230 is used so broadly now to like cover anything that seems to be happening other than the illegal content that Kate highlighted. So just to be really clear, I mean, a lot of people say, well, what does algorithmic transparency mean? First of all, yeah, there's a large talking point in the tech industry of like, but the tech industry doesn't even really know what their algorithms are doing. Well, they do know what the original intent when they're creating algorithms of what they want the algorithm to accomplish. And if they've decided that they want the algorithm to accomplish maximizing user engagement on their platform, then the algorithm figures out how to do that. Mm-hmm. But what I'm advocating for, rather than algorithmic transparency, is another way to look at it is not a publisher, not a platform. I think the companies like a Facebook are something else. And I don't care how you define it. I don't think we need to try to figure out how to take 2020 and fit it into the 1996 exact rules. I think we need to look at what 2020 is. Mm-hmm. And if we call them a digital curator or whatever you want to call them, what I would like to see, and I don't care if this is Section 230 or elsewhere, it is transparency around your recommendation engines, transparency around, like, we will never know if a recommendation engine actually introduced those two people to that group if they weren't even looking for it. We will never know if somebody who went out and murdered somebody was actually looking for some extreme group, whether it was recruitment by ISIS or whether it was a Boogaloo Boy group, if we don't know how the recommendation engine worked to begin with. That's where I think accountability lies. I don't want Mark Zuckerberg to be the arbiter of truth. I don't want Facebook to decide if what I say is true or false. But when we have a company that allows frictionless virality And there's no responsibility at the end of the day if something ends up actually creating real world harm. We need to start talking about how to look at that. So that's just my clarifying point. And you asked a question, and I don't remember what it was now because I got all.
No, I think you answered it in that great response. But I'd be interested, and then Kate, for your opinion on this, is let's imagine you do have this movement where companies would be held liable. How do you think social media would react to that? Is this something where they'll say, okay, well, if I'm going to be held responsible for more of the content or more of the kind of algorithmic kind of pushing that this is doing, the people we're connecting, then I'll just be a lot more conservative with my content moderation? Because if you look at Section 230, we oftentimes like to say that it has the right but not responsibility, typically around content moderation. Do you imagine with a lot of this kind of political push that the companies are then going to say, okay, we'll just kind of over moderate? Is that something you see as a concern, Kate?
Oh, yes, like absolutely. I mean, like 110%. One of the things that I think that people undersell is the damage that democratizing and participatory and like amplifying in good ways role that like all of these platforms play for everyday speech. I mean, right now, it used to be that like people who did op-eds, who had their ideas get out there, they had to, or like, excuse me, people who wanted to get their ideas out there had to write op-eds. They had to write books. They had to they had to find some other mechanism to publish their message and amplify it. Now they just self-publish through all of these platforms, and there is this incredible amount of power to that. Of course, you do have the same kind of powerful and people of influence having more ability to amplify their message, and you see power recapitulating itself online as it is in real life. But one of the things that I think is really harmful, and what I think about with Section 230, is that if you decide, it was interesting. I was doing a Section 230 conversation yesterday, and one of the things that was said by a former Facebook employee who does trust and safety and used to moderate was like, Section 230 protects the people doing the moderation work, the people who are making these judgments, because if they make a wrong call, then like it's just really not it, like they take it down and like Facebook will put it back up or something. But like if you get rid of Section 230, then like they've just put that like their company on the line for millions of dollars in lawsuits, and they're going to get fired. And so like they might take things down that they otherwise might have kept up, and then put an interstitial or something like that. So my favorite example of kind of this working the right way, and there's plenty of counterexamples of it working the wrong way, is like the Philando Castile live Facebook stream that happened, I think, in the summer of 2017, where Philando Castile was driving a car with his girlfriend and his child, and a police officer pulled him over. His girlfriend started filming, and as he was reaching for his registration, the police officer shot him point blank in like the chest. And the entire thing is live streamed, and it is gruesome. It is like the type of graphic violence that is like totally against the community standards of Facebook. But they decided to keep it up. After removing it briefly, they put it back up with an interstitial that said it was graphic violence, but it was incredibly newsworthy. It was incredibly important to kind of put out and notify people of kind of the harms that Black men experienced against in interactions with the police and how deadly they could be. And it had a lot of power. And there must have been 1,000. We know now there are thousands of Philando Castiles we never hear about. And but for Facebook, I mean, the causation thing goes both ways. Like, yes, but for Facebook, these two Bugaboo boys would have never met each other. But then but for Facebook, maybe we would never be where we were in 2017. And now again, in 2020, with Black Lives Matter. And so I just think that you have to kind of understand that there's a huge risk that comes to changing this in dramatic ways.
One of the trends we've seen on social media platforms, especially with Facebook, is really a move towards more private forms of communication, especially Facebook groups, where frankly a lot of this discussion is potentially happening, a lot of the problematic discussion. Do you think that there'll be a push towards more transparency around these private groups? I know there's been some recommendations that if a private group has, let's say, over 5,000 members, that it should be publicly accessible. What are your opinions? Yaël, we'll start with you. What are your opinions about that? Because if you think about it, there's been a movement to say, all right, let's make things more private, but that would actually, from a law enforcement standpoint, that might make it harder to determine when there are bad actors.
Yeah, and that gets into a whole nother very complicated field, right? There's a difference between private in terms of protecting users' privacy and private in terms of like encrypted and nobody can see what's in it. Those are, just to be really clear, I don't want to mix those two conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to actually be frank that I am still thinking through this exact challenge. I don't ever want to profess to have a fully formed thought before I do, because this one is really complex. Yes, I do see the absolute value to end-to-end encrypted messaging. For example, I mean, Signal, the ability to speak to whether it's activists or people who could really be at risk or journalists or whatever, it's really important. When it comes to a group on Facebook, I do think there might be, and I don't have the exact answer to this yet, but I do think there might be interesting ways to think about, I mean, let's look at WhatsApp. Actually, I'll give you an example, WhatsApp, right? So I had worked a bit on, I traveled to India when I was at Facebook to kind of look through what we were going to do about the upcoming elections there. And obviously WhatsApp is huge in India, right? And so what's the trouble with WhatsApp? It's encrypted. Facebook gets to say, well, we don't know what's going on in WhatsApp. So like, it's not our problem. But there were some like serious situations that started occurring where disinformation was being spread rampantly through WhatsApp. And then there were these questions of like, did that end up leading to lynchings in India and some really serious situations? So rather than saying that we should not allow WhatsApp to be encrypted or private, are there ways to make it healthier? Mm-hmm. For example, if something's going viral, if something is immediately going viral, generally something that goes viral, often it's because it created an emotional reaction. And there's a really good chance that something there is possibly not exactly accurate. So maybe you stop allowing people to share to more than 5 people at a time or to more than one person at a time. Maybe if groups, as you said, are beyond a certain amount of people, then maybe you do put some controls. As a group starts to get thousands and thousands of people in it, there is a real serious question. Is that group really, should we be completely private? We don't know what they're influencing. I don't know the answer, but I know you have to figure out how to balance safety and the public good with how you're going to think about either privacy or encryption. And then just the last thing I'll say about Section 230 is I agree. I don't think we should get rid of Section 230. I think most people who understand this issue don't. I just have to say one more time, though, it is overly used as an excuse to not define responsibility for some of the real things that are happening on these platforms. And we need to figure out how we will. And it might not be through Section 230. It might be through other laws. I blame our US legislators for not stepping up and figuring out, like, what do we want to do about basic protections to our elections, campaign finance online, voter suppression, which I wrote about today. Like, we need to talk about these things. And unfortunately, the tech lobbyists often use Section 230 as a way to completely squash the conversation. So to me, it's not that I have the legal answer exactly on what we should do about Section 230, but I'm tired of it being used as an excuse by some to not have the conversation at all.
Okay. Well, since you mentioned political kind of will and movement, Kate, I'd love to hear where we are right now with kind of the political bodies and their kind of movement around Section 230.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of action around Section 230, some of it better than others. I think the most memorable, I mean, and it was happening a couple of years ago. This has just been a resurgence, really. You've seen it in the last month, I would say, starting with Trump's executive order that was around social media bias and trying to basically address the claims of himself and his constituents that that Facebook and all of these other companies are discriminating against conservative voices in what they take down online. Then you had that executive order. We can get into it or not. It seems a lot like political theater, kind of, for most people who know it. Doesn't seem like, it seems like it's going to suck a lot of air out of like what could otherwise be a productive conversation. And so now we're going to have to like spend time talking about all of the ways in which this stupid executive order just gets every part of the law wrong, from like a very basic perspective, and smart people could be doing better things with their time. But then you saw Josh Hawley of Missouri with, again, I think a very political bill that just kind of tries to like get rid of, like puts up like this idea of just like getting rid of liability for Section 230, the immunity provisions of Section 230. That probably also doesn't have teeth, also probably won't go anywhere. And then you had a bipartisan bill that was released, a draft of which was released yesterday by Senator Schatz from Hawaii and Thune from, I can't remember, but Schatz is Democrat, Thune is Republican, that came out, called the PACT Act. I forget what the PACT stands for. Everyone loves their acronyms in Washington, and Facebook for that matter. Man, it's like speaking two different languages, like code switching between the two of them. That had, I think that having worked with Schatz's office, just like in a consultancy capacity, and never with Thune, I know that Schatz likes to be at the fore of these issues and has done a lot of good stuff in other capacities. I think it was a well-intentioned bill, but it did have some really bizarrely out-of-date proposals that just seem so classic in what is this disconnect between Washington and Silicon Valley. Things like calling for call centers to be manned for listening to people's complaints about the stuff that they hear online. So that kind of gets us like kind of my final takeaway of the day, and that'll be like kind of the last thing I have to say, which is just like that there is this Bruce Schneier who's a famous cybersecurity expert, has this wonderful line of technologists need to understand that they're building worlds, and policymakers need to understand that technologists are capable of building worlds. And I feel like that gets at this kind of disconnect between like the conversations that I have with people who are in tech and the conversations I have with people in DC. And it's just like, I feel like there's a few people, Yaël is one of them, and myself, who just do constant arbitrage between the two groups of trying to bring them into like kind of what the realities of the world are like. And hopefully we will like someday prevail. This is our, this is kind of why we do what we do. But until then, I think we're going to see a lot of kind of kerfluffle and fluttering about very angrily. So.
Well, that's the question I want to just bring up for our final question, and then we'll kind of close things down and obviously continue this. There's so much to talk about, just touching the surface. Kayla was talking about, this seems to be coming from both ends, Republicans and Democrats. Hey, maybe you'll have Trump and Biden on the debate stage agreeing about Section 230, but vastly for different reasons. But is there any shared overlap with their concern that you think we could make any positive movement on? Yeah, I'll start with you.
So two really good points that Kate just mentioned. I did get to know Schatz and Thune a little bit when I went with Tristan Harris to testify at a Senate hearing that the two of them co-sponsored, and it was on persuasive technologies. Both of these men actually care deeply about this issue, as Kate mentioned. I also do not think that the PACT Act solves any of the problems we're really talking about right now, which is unfortunate, but we also have to understand the legislative process, right? Like we were talking about this earlier, everybody kind of puts these few little ideas and then they hope they can all fight about it to get a bigger bill. Unfortunately, I don't think the PACT Act, as I read it quickly this morning, gets there. But I do think there are people, so one of the arguments actually, which also goes to what Kate was just saying, is that like government people are just too stupid to understand tech. I don't think that's what she said, but I mean, that's what a lot of people say. And I spent most of my life in government, so I take offense in general to being called stupid, but I think we have to understand, I didn't say you were, Kate. I said other people who like to say that.
We said before, no flame war. We want both of you to
No, that's my point. Kate just, a lot of people in the tech industry like to imply that like government's too stupid to get this. Yeah. And it's that I would just argue just because you're not a computer scientist doesn't mean you're stupid. There are different sets of incentives here, right? And government's incentive at the end of the day, and I don't necessarily mean ego-driven politicians. Don't forget there are a lot of people in government who are there literally because they are serving their country. And their incentive, my incentive in government was my customer was the American people. My goals were to figure out how to protect democracy, how to protect Americans, how to protect against our greatest threats. And in technology, it's a different incentive structure, right? Some people really are idealistic, building a greater world, whatever it is. But unfortunately, as they grow, the incentive is protecting your shareholders and profit. And that's fine. And maybe you still, when you work at one of these companies, have this idealistic vision of what you're trying to build. But these are different incentive structures. And so a lot of times, yes, there are old senators who don't understand technology. That is true. But they do understand that their role is to protect the American people and to protect our democracy. And so maybe they don't always come up with the absolute best solutions. But having a different incentive structure doesn't mean you're stupid. It just means you are looking at a problem differently. I do think to Kayla's question that popped up a second ago, I do think that there's more similarity than one would believe across different sides. I mean, Kate brought up Josh Hawley. So super political when he talks, but if you talk to him behind the scenes, he is so much smarter on this issue than when he's grandstanding, and that's what he's doing. He's political grandstanding. I hate it. I hate when people politically grandstand, and it squashes smart conversations about how to move forward. I think in our poisonous political climate, we're not going to get consensus on anything. Guess what? I kind of think that Facebook has a little bit of responsibility for some of the increased polarization. Go read the Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street Journal piece on that. I don't see any consensus coming between now and November on what to do about Section 230 because both sides are using it as political baseball. But if we can get past November and Lord knows what happens then, I do think there's a potential for, I recommend watching yesterday's hearing. There was a congressional hearing from the energy sector, the Energy and Commerce Committee, and it was about disinformation, but it was really all about Section 230. It was a very interesting hearing and really good questions were raised. Well, so it's possible, but not in this political environment right now.
Well, unfortunately, that's where we're going to have to wrap it up, but we'll actually put that hearing clip in a follow-up to everybody attending today. So I do want to thank Yaël and Kate for being on the discussion about Section 230. And please join us at alltechishuman.org to continue this conversation, and then check out our partner, TheBridge, at thebridgework.com. Yaël and Kate, I love just quickly for you to say where people can continue this conversation with you and find you online.
I'm my last name, Klonick, on Twitter. And if you have not had enough 230 conversations in 45 minutes, you can come watch me do 90 more minutes. I will, if there's links in my Twitter bio. But yeah, thank you for having me. Well,
thank you. You're on the Section 230 circuit. I love it. All right, Yaël.
And on Twitter, I'm my full name so that the Russians can't clone me at Yaël Eisenstat. Just tweeted the piece I wrote today about Facebook's responsibility in voter suppression. So you can find me there. And that's probably the best place to find me.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you both for coming on for this thoughtful discussion, and thank everybody for their comments. And let's continue at All Tech is Human. So Yaël and Kate, thank you both. And I'm David Ryan Polgar. Stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.